Yes, sir.
All right,
Well,
perfect.
I'm prepared to be challenged and I'm prepared to be corrected if I'm in error.
Oh, there we go. We like that.
Uh, first
All
off,
right.
I would like first off, I would like to say, Jared, you're one of the people that actually got me into race realism, HVD, and all that stuff. And I actually just wanted to tell you that I respect you a lot.
Well, thank you very much. The it's the thing about it is once you understand the reality of race and how it works itself out in history and in current social affairs, it's very, very difficult to go back. All of a sudden, things make sense that didn't make sense before. And that's why I think so many people are coming around to a race realist view, because once the scales fall from your eyes, things that required all sorts of strange ad hoc Rube Goldberg explanations suddenly all fall into place in a coherent way. So there's no, I don't know, it. There's no particular reason to congratulate oneself on opening people's eyes up to what is and should be rather an obvious set of facts.
All right, so I was starting with a plan which was to talk about Jared's life and how he got there, but race realism is in the house. He has a contest, and so that changes my plans totally. But let's talk about race then. And maybe then we can talk about Jared's life and how he got to the position he is. For those who don't know him, he is the editor of American Renaissance. He has been a white advocate for more than 25 years, from what I understand. He is a very early participant to the movement that then became that then was joined by the alt-right in some way, but he is one of the very early white advocates and advocates for the liberty of the white race to unite together and to associate with each other. And he makes a point of uh, always insisting on the fact that what he wants for the white race, he wants it for all the people in the world, and he wouldn't deny the liberty of any people to group together. Is that a fair representation, Jared?
Yes, yes, that's very fair. I don't ask anything for whites that I'm not perfectly prepared to grant to every other racial group. And also, if there are people who wish to live in mixed, multicultural, multiracial societies, God bless them. They're allowed to do that too. It's just that those of us who prefer to live in a racially coherent society, we should not be demonized and we should not be prevented from doing so.
And
So
and
just so
also,
we,
by the way, just real fast, race realist here said he could only stay for about what, like 45 more minutes. So it's
Um,
perfect for us to. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I can stay until about 8 o'clock, 8:15.
Okay, cool. And then we could do the thing that JF had planned about the history of Jared. That'd be very interesting. And I have a lot of questions myself. So yeah, definitely we could do that.
so it's always good to start with definitions. When we talk about race realism, there are people who have this vision of race that is solely biological. They only care about the genes. And I was wondering, Jared, do you include cultural factors within your view of race?
Race is primarily a biological phenomenon, and that's why it's so easy to distinguish people of different races, not merely by visual inspection, but even more precisely by DNA analysis. And the DNA is not affected by culture. The DNA is as it is, as we've inherited from our parents. At the same time, it would be a mistake to assume that somehow environment has no effect on the way people of different races turn out, the way they behave, and their cultures that they assume. Take the Koreans, North and South. Genetically, they're very, very similar people, but they live under very different regimes, and you have a very different kind of society that they've created. On the other hand, if those two countries were ever to reunite, I think it would not be very difficult for them to establish within a generation or two a genuinely unified or whole or mostly unified country because they are genetically the same.
Interesting. And race realist, what was your exact contention with Jared's points?
I don't believe that there is any utility to IQ.
Any utility to IQ?
Yes, sir.
What do you mean by utility?
Well, I mean, people try to say that people with a higher IQ have a higher G factor, general intelligence, and that this pretty much somehow contributes to success in life, that people have a survey of good genes, bad genes that give positive or negative charges,
Mm.
and people like I think that people just fetishize it too much, and largely it's it's not it's not too useful.
Well, intelligence is without a doubt the most carefully and extensively studied human personality trait. People have been trying to understand what intelligence is and to measure it for more than 100 years, and compared to such things as gregariousness or introversion or agreeableness, psychopathy, intelligence has really been the subject of very, very intense analysis because it is an extremely important human trait. And intelligence is both definable and, I believe, measurable. And IQ tests measure it reliably and, for the most part, accurately, not right down to the 10th of a percentage point by any means. But this is an extremely important human trait that is associated with all sorts of measures of success in life. Your likelihood to graduate from college, to get married and stay married, not have illegitimate children, your likelihood to be a criminal, your likelihood to go on welfare. All of these things are very closely correlated, not to a one-to-one degree, but they're closely correlated with intelligence. And many of the things that we consider to be social problems in the United States, poverty or illegitimacy or crime, these things tend to be very strongly correlated with low IQ. And most people, most psychologists, professionals in the area have no dispute about the importance of intelligence, not only as a predictor of various outcomes in human life, but the fact that it is controlled to a very substantial degree by genetics, that IQ is generally highly heritable. Where there is disagreement is whether or not the measured differences in IQ between different population groups, specifically racial groups, the extent to which there's a genetic contribution there. But no, I don't wish to fetishize IQ, but if you have a society with an average IQ of 105, you're simply going to get different outcomes compared to a society where the average IQ is 80 or 85. I think that's more or less an indubitable fact.
So, Race Realist, do you contest this view that IQ and intelligence, which Jared just stated, are the most studied social or personality characteristics, as he called them? Would you disagree with this statement?
In the field of psychology, no, I would not. But that's largely true.
Yeah.
There are still people who would pretend that somehow IQ is this abstract and irrelevant capacity that is measured only by a capacity to take IQ tests. It's astonishing to me that people still cling to that idea, but there's a surprising number of people who would be far happier to think that the mind really is a blank slate and that intelligence is not a function of what we inherit from our parents in the form of our genetic endowment, but that it is exclusively a result of environment. As I say, it's astonishing to me that people might still hold this view, but there is something about the liberal mind that yearns for the idea that human inequality can be eradicated by means of social intervention. And I think that's what gives rise to this illusion about intelligence. Mostly the people who maintain that illusion, they are generally fairly intelligent, well-educated people themselves. The only people they know are very similar to themselves. I remember it was very interesting to me when I was a college student. I did a lot of hitchhiking around, and I'd get picked up by people from all walks of life. And I remember remarking and observing, reflecting on the fact that, boy, in my own personal life, there are just loads of different social classes, different professions that I have no contact with at all. I remember marveling at just how little some of these people who would pick me up knew about some of just the most obvious things. And so people who live in a kind of a high IQ bubble, it's very easy for them to assume that everybody's that way. And for them to think that, well, I graduated from college, everybody I know graduated from college, well, then everyone in the world must be able to graduate from college. This is a very self-selected sample. And it's like, I remember there was a famous case of a professor at University of Boston who couldn't believe that George W. Bush won the election. He says, I don't know anybody who voted for him. Well, plenty of other people did, fella. And people are different. And this is something that some liberals have a very, very difficult time accepting.
As philosopher Jonathan Haidt once pointed, that's why you know no one who eats at Applebee's, yet Applebee's survive.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. No, people self-select to a remarkable degree, and unless you are aware of the enormous variety of human experience and human capabilities, it's very, very easy to tumble into this very blinkered, narrow-minded view that everyone agrees with you, everyone thinks the way you do.
I do have a personal experience to share on that. I've been in some of the most elite lab in neurobiology in the world. I've been hanging with Nobel Prizes. I've been hanging with the top IQ in this world. And then I became co-host on Warski Live. The contrast is huge.
In other words, this is a remarkable step up, and now you find yourself surrounded by people who are vastly more intelligent than the people you used to spend time with, right?
So, race realist, you talked about fetishizing IQ. It is not my impression from talking with white nationalists and white advocates today that they are fetishizing IQ. It seems to me that the left-wing critique of the alt-right is fetishizing IQ more than the alt-right itself. And the best case for this is that if people like Jared were fetishizing IQ, they would want an Asian ethno-state, not a white ethno-state. Don't you think?
Yeah. Well, I'm always amused when I'm referred to as a white supremacist. I think, first of all, a white supremacist is someone who, as a white person, wishes to dominate or rule over people of other races. And I think no one that I know has any such desire. But if a white supremacist is defined as someone who thinks that white people are superior to people of other races, I certainly don't fit that description. I think, as you suggest just now, JF, the evidence is overwhelming that Asians have somewhat higher IQs than whites, and that there's probably a genetic contribution to this. So that's the way the evidence points, and I have no objection when the evidence leads in a particular direction. I think it'd be silly to pretend otherwise, and to therefore think that IQ is the only thing, the main thing. No, I wish for my people to survive. I have a huge respect for Asians. As we just discussed, I spent a lot of time in Japan. I speak Japanese. I have many Japanese friends. But I don't want the United States or Europe to become Japanese or Asian. And that strikes me as a perfectly natural, normal, healthy way to think. The idea that IQ is important. In the American context, it is necessary to bring up IQ because white people are always being blamed for the current state of blacks. When blacks are less likely to be successful economically or to fail in school or to be arrested by the police and go to jail, we are always told that this is the fault of wicked white people who have oppressed them in the past and continue to oppress them to this day. Now, it's not a pleasant subject of conversation to say to blacks as a group, well, fellas, the fact is, on average, you do not have the same equipment upstairs as white people. I wish that we had no reason to bring this point up, but whites have to talk about this in self-defense, as it were, because if they are unwilling to talk about this, if whites do agree, well, yes, black people are just as smart and hardworking as white people. They have absolutely the same intellectual genetic endowment as whites. If we accept this idea, then what else is there to explain the relative lack of success among blacks? And it's for this reason that I believe whites are willy-nilly forced into bringing up what is, I would agree, an unpleasant subject.
Is the one video, actually it was the first video to ever be put onto Limited State, was your video on IQ and race. Is that right?
That's my understanding. I mean, it may have been that there were others that on that same day were put into quarantine earlier than our video on IQ and race, but it certainly happened on the very first day that YouTube started implementing its new policy on so-called hate. But this is a subject that apparently terrifies people. Why it terrifies people is a bit of a mystery to me. Although I remember getting something of an insight into that entire question years ago in San Francisco. I used to live on the West Coast, and I remember meeting a woman at a party. And we were just chatting about all manner of different things. And the whole question of the success or lack of success of people of different races came up. And she was very much a liberal. And she was horrified by the idea that there might be genetic differences between the races, and that explained the differences in behavior. And I made a couple of arguments that she'd never heard of before. I think they were fairly persuasive arguments. And to my astonishment, she said, well, if that's true, we just have to exterminate them all. Wait a minute. No, that does not follow at all. But there seems to be, perhaps that is the hidden fear in many liberals, that if race realists are correct about this, and there are biological differences between the races that account for differences in achievement, then the only solution is some sort of dramatic, bloodthirsty one. That's not at all the case. For generation after generation, for most of certainly the last 500 years, the majority of white people assumed that white people on average were more intelligent than blacks. That didn't lead to extermination, never led to any kind of hint of extermination. There certainly was slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and colonization, all of those things. But no one wants to return to that. And the idea that somehow biological differences will lead to some kind of catastrophic bloodletting, this is just a completely crazy idea. And yet, I believe somewhere lurking in the liberal mind is this fear that this will be a calamity if we accept the truth about race and IQ.
So to pursue on the question of family discussions about race realism, we have a super chat. The person asked, how should I begin a conversation with my Christian family about race realism without getting into the theological debate over the age of the earth? In other words, he seemed to be suggesting that the non-willingness of learning about evolution and biology may be a barrier here.
And that was Fast Stampede. Thank you for the $20, man. Appreciate it.
Well, that's a good question. Although you do not have to accept evolution in order to recognize that the races are different. And if you believe in the young Earth creationist theory, that the Earth is only, about 4,000 years old, it is clear that there are different races that have created different levels of society. And it seems to me that if there are pygmies, and if there are Australian Aborigines, and if there are Eskimos, if there are Danes, then God must have created them that way, and there's no reason on earth to think that they are similar. If within the 4,000 years that we have all been presumably on Earth, the Danes have created a certain kind of civilization, and the Australian Aborigines have not, then what is the difficulty in accepting that there are differences in capacity, even if we do not accept, even if a Christian does not accept that those differences are a consequence of separate evolution under differing environmental circumstances?
Interesting. And just real fast, by the way, Pop TV, thank you for that donation. $100, man. Appreciate it, man. You're amazing. And I will follow you on Twitter. Yeah, and I want to also just press on Race Realist here. Is there any other contentions with what Jared is saying?
Okay, first off, I didn't mean that Jared fetishized IQ. I just meant in general. Second of all, I would like to ask Jared how he defines IQ and whether or not he believes there is a consensus in the psychological community on what the definition of IQ is. I would also like to quote a 2002 paper by Ken Richardson, where he describes a 1986 study by Detterman and Sternberg, where he writes, of the 25 attributes of intelligence mentioned, only 3 were mentioned by 25% or more of respondents. Half of the respondents mentioned higher level components, 25% mentioned executive processes, and 29% mentioned that which is valued by culture. Over a third of the attributes were mentioned by less than 10% of respondents. Only 8% of the 1986 respondents mentioned ability to learn. And it even went so far as Jensen writing in his 1998 book, The G Factor, that that he warns that the word intelligence has proved to be undefinable without a scientifically acceptable degree of consensus on page 45.
Well, there certainly are differing ideas as to what are the components of intelligence. The word intelligence, on the other hand, exists in every known language. It describes something that human beings intuitively understand. I think if you were to try to describe sex appeal, what is it that makes a woman appealing sexually? Not everyone would agree, but most men would agree that there is such a thing as sex appeal. And likewise, in the case of intelligence, for me, intelligence is an ability to look at the facts in a situation and draw the right conclusions. That to me is one of the key concepts of intelligence. It's not necessarily the capacity to learn. People can memorize without being particularly intelligent. It's not necessarily creativity. There can be creative people who are not necessarily high in IQ. I would certainly agree that there is not a universally accepted definition for intelligence. And yet, we all instinctively understand that some people are better able to see to the essence of a problem, to find correct solutions to problems. We all understand this and we all experience this in our daily lives. When we were in class in school, there were children who were smarter than other children. None of this is particularly difficult to understand at an intuitive level. And I believe that by somehow saying, because it's impossible to come up with a definition that everyone will accept, there is no such thing as intelligence. That's like saying that because there may be no agreement on the number of races, that there's no such thing as race. This is an attempt to completely sidetrack a question that I believe comes from ultimately dishonest motives.
Well, how do IQ tests test intelligence?
They test intelligence by setting problems. Now, one of the traditional complaints about IQ tests is that they have been culturally loaded and that they test cultural knowledge rather than actual brute intelligence that has nothing to do with culture. There are now culture-free tests, the best known of which is Raven's progressive matrices. And this involves recognizing patterns and trying to figure out what is the next step in a pattern. This is a test that doesn't require any language at all. You could show the initial simple examples. If you have in the first square, you've got 1 dot, the next square, 3 dots. What would be the third square? And you have a choice between 3 dots, 5 dots, 20 dots. Well, the next step is going to be 3 dots. You can explain what the initial patterns are to someone who doesn't even speak English, and then ask them to go ahead and complete the succeeding problems that are more difficult. No language involved at all. And this is something that correlates very, very tightly with more traditional verbally based IQ tests. Again, this is an attempt to measure a capacity that we all inherently recognize as existing, even though we may not be able to define it to everyone's mutual satisfaction, but one that is definitely there. Ultimately, we will be able to measure intelligence through direct assessment of the brain. That it will be possible to do that through genetic analysis. We are beginning to discover the gene patterns that are associated with high intelligence. Already there have been patent applications for IQ tests based on genetic analysis. We really aren't at the point at which, by spitting in a cup and analyzing the DNA, we can tell that this guy has 140 IQ, this guy's 105 IQ. But we will eventually get there. At the same time, there are aspects of the brain that can be analyzed, the rapidity with which the signals are transmitted from one part of the brain to the other, the density of gray matter, the efficiency with which white matter communicates between the different gray matter areas of the brain. I'm quite confident that there will become a time when you can just strap on a set of electrodes and have someone think about something, or even not even think about anything at all. And we will be able to assess the power of the brain directly through physical assessment. Now, people are welcome to imagine that this is impossible or be skeptical about that, but I think we're definitely moving in that direction. And when the day comes when we really have discovered a large number of the genetic patterns that are associated with high intelligence, and there will be many of them, because the brain's the most complicated organ in the human body, and a very substantial part of the human genome goes into constructing the brain. When we've gotten to the bottom of this mystery, I would bet the next dozen mortgage payments that those patterns, alleles as they're called, genetic patterns that are associated with high intelligence, will not be found to be equally distributed between people of all races.